Brandon Sanderson is a giant in the fantasy fiction space and one of the leading members of the 1,000-page book club. I feel so bad for his editor. When I discovered his Mistborn trilogy, I was blown away by the relatable characters, the innovative magic system, and especially the jaw-dropping thriller-style plot twists. But he's also a dispenser of writing advice, and I think we can glean several bits of tabletop RPG advice from his wisdom. Here are 6 tips for running D&D and other tabletop games adapted from his lessons. First up is his third law of magic. Don't let the numbering system confuse you. The advice here is to expand what you already have before you add something new. He says, I often fall into the trap of thinking that bigger is better and more is more awesome. I've said that my job as a game master is to throw different toys on the floor and see which ones the players pick up. And while having quest or hook options is good, it's certainly possible to have too many. I played in a Rime of the Frostmaiden campaign and we were traveling among the 10 towns of Icewind Dale. Each of the 10 towns has its own quest hooks, so after visiting a few towns, we had racked up about a dozen different potential quests. It became way too overwhelming, so us players had to have a timeout meeting where we ranked things and decided what to focus on, like a tech startup having an all-staff meeting to determine their Q4 goals and deliverables. That worked out okay for us, but it probably shouldn't have gotten that far. We should have stopped pursuing new quests, and the DM should have avoided more complication by making certain quest givers unavailable until we had a more manageable workload. You have to consider Sly Flourish's theory that half your players don't know what's going on half the time. Recently in a campaign I run, this resulted in the PCs unintentionally helping the quote-unquote wrong side in a faction conflict because they were confused about prior events. I should have been more clear, and they should have asked for more info. So in addition to making yourself stop throwing down new toys, another primary way to fix the situation is look for opportunities to combine quests. Here's an example from my current campaign. The players previously needed to heist a MacGuffin from a casino, but they weren't able to pull it off. So they left, and that quest is still open. They're also tangentially involved with fighting an organization dealing in illicit drugs. So I could combine these two lines by making the casino owner in cahoots with the drug trade, and that gives the party a reason to return to the casino, potentially solving or at least making progress on both quest tracks at once. Next up is dealing with the internal editor. Sanderson says you can always rewrite later. When you start writing, the most important thing is to learn that you don't start off perfect. Let yourself make mistakes, and don't worry, just keep writing and practicing. This is true for both writing and running tabletop games. When I was plotting my noir thriller novel Blood Thief, I knew I wanted to make the third act finale revolve around an intricate action sequence set atop a series of moving gondolas at Vale Ski Resort. It seemed super cool in my head, but then sent me into a panic when I actually sat down to write it. The scope and logistics of how such a thing would work were terribly intimidating. But I did end up writing it, and I believe I managed to pull it off because I remembered this simple trick. I didn't have to get it perfect right away. I was able to write it clumsily at first, read it back, then refine it until it flowed well and worked logically. The same is true for planning a TTRPG campaign. In D&D, the rewriting here is changing your future beats. You can't edit a previous session, obviously, but you can always change what you plan to do based on the new information. Did the PCs kill off the big baddie in Session 8 due to a crazy stroke of luck? This is a simple fix. As the BBEG dies, they say,
"You have no idea what you've just unleashed."
Because it now turns out that the baddie had actually been keeping a greater evil at bay. Or the baddie has a bigger boss who's now going to come after the party. This is how you rewrite in tabletop RPGs. Real quick, since I have you, could I get a like and subscribe below? It only takes a second, and make sure you click all next to notifications. Third on our list is the through line. Brandon says, remember to pick a single, solid conflict to be your overarching story conflict. You can have subplots, but you should be able to explain the main conflict for your story in a couple sentences. Now we're going to have to interpret this advice a little bit. While it may be ideal, it's not often possible to have your campaign building toward a single, overarching story conflict from Session 1 to Session 50. See my last point about the party killing the BBEG way before you intended. You have to take care to avoid being railroady by giving your baddies plot armor or negating player choices to drive them toward a predetermined end. For us, this quote is more about the second sentence, explaining your main story conflict in a couple sentences. It's completely fine to not know where the campaign will end up or who the final baddie will be. But what you do need is a singular, easy-to-understand call to action for your party. What is it that drives them toward adventure? You need to know it, and they need to know it. Without being spoilery, we can use Critical Role as a good example. In campaigns 1 and 2, the final baddies don't actually appear until late in the campaigns, but Matt Mercer ties their presence to previous events and characters to give the whole thing a sense of continuity. I would be more specific about that, but it would be super spoilers. If you know, you know. Next, let's chat about the senses. Sanderson doth say, focus on concrete details. Don't just describe how things look. Add in occasional scents, sounds, and textures. Mix this in with action, dialogue, and motion in the story. Don't just stop for a page and describe the town. Instead, have your characters enter town, then talk about the scent of the muddy road, the sounds of the screaming innkeeper's wife, the feel of the chill spring wind. That will make the story feel alive while still progressing. Certain published TTRPG adventures love to get flowery with boxed text description. It's usually a mistake to read out the whole thing, skim it, and then summarize it in your own voice instead. My players have a sense for when I'm reading boxed text and they quickly tune out. I'm guilty of this too when I'm a player. One thing that's always helpful when setting a scene is to remember the 5 senses: sight, touch, taste, smell, sound. Write these on a sticky note and plop it on the inside of your GM screen or the corner of your computer monitor. When the party arrives at a new location, pick 3 of these senses and rattle off some details. As you stroll the town's main street, the smell of fresh bread from a bakery draws your eyes to a building on the west side. There, under a green awning, stands a beaten and bruised dragonborn in ratty robes who wheezes and stares as you walk by. We've engaged a few senses without being wordy, added a potential plot hook, and done it in only about 5 seconds. Your PCs are probably going to want to talk to that dragonborn, or at the very least, go buy a loaf of bread. Here's a quick one, and that's session focus. Brandon says, don't try to write too many viewpoints at first. Remember, even Robert Jordan started small when it came to viewpoints. The first book focuses on Rand mostly, and only adds other viewpoints later after the group splits up. One of the least fun jobs of a game master is making sure no one hogs the spotlight for too long. Putting the focus on one player and PC for a short time is fine, but you always have to be conscious of the attention span of the other players. Splitting the party can result in huge chunks of time with some of the table growing bored. If that one spotlighted PC is in a high-stakes solo outing, it can still be engaging for the others to watch. But most often the party is split during things like downtime, when not a lot of exciting stuff is going on. So if you do find yourself in a situation where you are putting the focus on someone, remember to move it around after only a brief amount of time to make sure everyone who wants to be included feels included. Finally, on being original, Sanderson says try to blend familiar ideas with those that are original. In other words, don't try to do everything new, but also don't just retread old ground. The best stories have identifiable characters facing identifiable conflicts, but in different ways and different places. Some of the best surprises in games are done by putting just a small twist on what's known and expected. For example, it's fine to have your party meet in a tavern in session 1, but then how about as soon as the group has sat down and introduced themselves, an arcane bomb suddenly explodes from behind the bar and now everyone is thrown into combat. It's fine to offer the party 10 gold pieces to clear out a cellar of rats. But how about as soon as they come back for payment, the quest giver says, actually, I just got robbed of the gold I was going to pay you, and the thieves took off into the night that-a-way. Those little deviations from common tropes can make any game feel fresh and exciting. So that is 6 hefty pieces of writing advice stolen from Brandon Sanderson, adapted for us game masters for D&D or any tabletop RPG. If you haven't read Mistborn, give it a try, it's really good. I'll put a link to it on Amazon below in the description. Until next time, this is GM Jim. Now go out there and have some fun.